Here are the details that every American needs to know about this plan.
Medicare will become law on July 1st, 1966.
I want America to have the finest health care in the world.
This healthcare system of ours is badly broken, and it is time to fix it.
Well, we spend $2.7 trillion every year on healthcare.
Our healthcare is too uncertain and too expensive, too bureaucratic and too wasteful.
This legislation will not fix everything that ails our healthcare system, but it moves us decisively in the right direction.
And we will always protect your Medicare, and we will always protect your Social Security.
This is what change looks like. This is what change looks like.
Well, Dr. Amol Navathe, how are you?
I'm good, Ned. How are you?
I cannot complain, man. It's getting kind of humid down here in Florida, but the hurricane missed us, so I'm okay. We're good.
well, your hurricane is up here right now as a tropical storm, so.
Yeah, so I apologize. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I am super excited for this conversation, and I wanted to start out with a question I ask everyone, but I'm really excited to ask you this question because your expertise and your focus is it's as broad from, alternative payment models all the way to AI and predictive analytics and what we're doing in healthcare. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on where we are today as a healthcare industry from where you stand.
So I think it's a fantastic question, very overarching, obviously. And there's a number of areas where I think as a healthcare industry, we're more mature and others where we're not so mature. But if I put it chronologically, say, we think of this as like an infant growing up to be an adult, I would say the healthcare industry right now is kind of like a teenager, right? Maybe a preteen, okay? Maybe a preteen. And the reason I say that is, say if you take 30, 40, 50 years ago, very much a cottage industry, right? Physicians practicing by themselves, not quite like the startup where you're practicing out of your garage, but actually not too far off, maybe
yeah.
in your office, but otherwise pretty much like practicing out of your garage. Pretty siloed, hospitals, physicians, nursing homes, everybody kind of doing their own thing, head down, not really thinking about how what I do affects somebody else. And probably most importantly, without a great sense of industrialization, right? And I mean that in a positive way. So what I mean by that is, information flows. Think about, the Toyota lean system of trying to create a repeatable, high quality product off of manufacturing line. Were we doing that in healthcare 30, 40, 50 years ago? Certainly not. There's a tremendous amount of variation. We saw that in the 1970s when Jack Wenberg from Dartmouth put out the Dartmouth Atlas as, oh my God, look at all this unwarranted variation. It's not warranted based on clinical reasons. It's just idiosyncrasies of local industry, of how it's developed. So I think we've started to make some progress there, right? I think we've developed more technology. We've certainly developed a lot of technology in the space of pharmaceuticals, in the space of devices, and that medical technology has been great. I would say the place that we're still a child, if you will, as an industry is really in the healthcare delivery space, right? We're more mature on technology. I think we're less mature when you think about the healthcare delivery space, where we still aren't very good at getting repeatable good outcomes, right? We still have big disparities. We don't understand why those disparities really exist. I think we call them social determinants of health. But what's underlying social determinants of health? There's structural racism. There's a bunch of factors that impact how people interpret and understand their own health. At the end of the day, I think actually it's a pretty catch-all term for, gosh, we don't really know exactly why we have these big racial disparities. Some of them are probably related to how we deliver care. Some of them are related to how individuals and patients make decisions and access care and think about their health care and what their other priorities are, like taking care of a grandma or their kids, or making ends meet on a budget perspective. There's a whole bunch of range of issues. So I think we're closer to infancy on that piece. I think we have a lot of growth to do. And then we have what I think of as kind of the technology that really integrates the two, which is artificial intelligence and the latest stuff that we have coming out, where algorithms are trying to interpret clinical data, make sense of it, and actually are now reaching certainly outside of the four walls of the hospital or any particular facility, but to do things like predict who's going to be readmitted to the hospital, predict who we should be directing resources to. And that area, I think, is, we have a lot of algorithms out there. That doesn't mean we're very mature about it. I think we're actually, again, kind of like a child, probably in the toddler phase on the AI side, right? So I think we have some growth to do. We have, probably most importantly, I think, we need to grow up and be an industrialized industry. And there's just a lot of variation. In some places, we're much better than we are in others, but in general, in healthcare delivery, I think we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I want to double down on the technology and variation, right? It something that, do you see, I know you do a ton of research, do you see artificial intelligence like making the variation smaller, or is that something that right now, as you see it, we can't even really kind of predict like the variation curve?
Yeah, I think aspirationally, I think many think one of the great promises of AI is that we can get rid of variation, right? In principle, the variation that we see hypothetically would be related to factors that are not controllable by the clinical profession, right? So in other words, if we can use AI to get people the best treatment at the best time in the best place, and they're going to maximize their own personal outcome, doesn't mean that everybody's going to have a great outcome, but those outcomes will not be dictated by the healthcare delivery, or the variation won't be dictated by the healthcare delivery. I think we're in a dangerous place right now when it comes to artificial intelligence. I think that's the promise. That's where, I work in the space. That's where I'd love to see us go. I think there is promise there, which is one of the reasons I'm excited to work in the space. I think there's there's a lot of data there. There's a lot of technical capability that we've grown in the last 10 years even. That's awesome. And it really is awesome, right? There's like a tremendous amount of potential here. At the same time, there's so many risks and dangers that we are learning about. There's perpetuating biases, right? There's one of the things that I've written now at this point fairly extensively about is one of the most challenging pieces of applying AI to clinical data is that clinical data is not randomly generated, right? So the fact that I, as a doctor, right, and I actually just finished 2 weeks of service in the hospital at the Philadelphia VA, taking care of patients, I'm not, dear God, I hope not, right? I'm not randomly ordering tests for patients. I'm ordering tests that I think are important clinically for this patient more than that patient. I'm actually trying to be quite conscious about being a good judicious sort of allocator of scarce resources. And so inherently, we're not randomly sampling, right? Yeah. And that's a big problem for AI algorithms because they're not necessarily thinking about what the data generating process is. They're trying to link data with relationships and outcomes that we care about. And if there's an underlying process that is in the minds of humans, right, the idea that we're going to suddenly use an algorithm to improve upon human decision-making actually is kind of quirky. I mean, quirky is maybe a nice way of saying it. Maybe you could even say it's stupid. I mean, it's not really, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be too harsh about it, but I think it does give us, I think, a lot of work to do. It gives a big challenge, there's a big hurdle to get past. And, social scientists and computer scientists, I think there are techniques to try to get there. But by and large, my main concern right now is as a community, we in AI and medicine, if you will, at a broad level, where this kind of non-random data generating process, because humans are making decisions that dictate what data we see, where that exists, I don't think we're quite laser focused on it yet. So I've made that kind of a big part of what I've been trying to push. Because I think unless we do that, we're not going to achieve our promise. And in fact, we might do a lot more harm than good.
Yeah, I know in one of your papers, you talked a lot about like the benchmarking, right? And making sure that, I think actually I have what you guys wrote down here, where it says products based on predictive algorithms are almost never evaluated against a standard of care, as standards for comparison are not well defined in the FDA's pre-market clearance program. Studies can be conducted without comparing to clinicians' predictions or guideline-based prediction scores. What do we, like, when it comes to the benchmarking and when it comes to like actually a standard of care? Because I think that's really, at least from the conversations that I've had, being in, I'm sort of in like this Medicare Advantage bubble, right? And everyone's talking AI and Medicare Advantage right now. Every single person I talk to is like, what's AI going to do, right? But I think that, you talk about a standard of care right there. And how do we get to that standard of care with a computer?
Great question. Really hard answer.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
A really hard answer because, at the end of the day, if you think about how a pharmaceutical drug is tested and taken to market, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of clinical validation that's done. It's not just it's a nerdy analogy, but it's a useful analogy. So if I invent a new molecule because I think it's going to reduce heart attacks, right? I can't just market it because it's a new molecule, right? I have to go through safety and then efficacy and do randomized trials before the FDA signs off on it. And right now, if we think about how the FDA and it's a hard job. Trust me, I'm glad I'm not a regulator here, right? Because I think even with the best of intentions, it's a really hard job. Yep. So, the FDA right now doesn't force you to do this clinical randomized trial. And what that looks like in the context of different AI algorithms, I think one of the challenges is that it looks very different depending on what you're trying to do, right? In the context of that piece that we're trying to make a point about is to the extent that you're using clinical data and you're creating a prediction, saying there's an intervention, risk stratifying groups of people, right, in real time to influence clinical practice, well, then at that point, we probably should be using a benchmark, to use your term, of what clinicians would do without that algorithm, right? So if I have an algorithm-based world, let me test it against a non-algorithm-based world. And let's see if we actually get better outcomes. Because one of the tricky things, right, if you take almost any health services type of outcome, so take being readmitted to the hospital, right? So readmissions have been heavily pursued in the past decade as something that if we cut them down, we're going to make our system more efficient. Medicare, as you know, put out a big program right after the Affordable Care Act that penalized hospitals with excess readmissions. So everybody's been chasing readmissions. Now, the reality is that even if I do well at predicting who's going to be readmitted, that doesn't mean necessarily that I understand why they're readmitted. And so there's a difference between the prediction piece and the causal piece, right? The causal link there, the causal factor, that also, not only do I need to figure out what is the causal factor, I also need to know that it's something that's modifiable, right? That I have an intervention that can modify it and do it in an effective way at scale and what have you. So there's several steps there. And so I think the challenge here is that if I am actually an algorithm developer, right? It's not really in my toolbox necessarily. It's not necessarily in my interest to try to make an impact to say, I'm not going to release this algorithm into the world until I've gone through that extensive multi-step process of clinical validation. And in fact, maybe that algorithm actually has other value, and so people will be able to use it for valuable reasons in other settings. And so there's a good case to say that I shouldn't have to wait that long. On the other hand, if somebody doesn't really understand what that algorithm is doing, predicting readmissions, for example, and says, okay, I'm going to turn around and use it as a way to improve healthcare delivery and outcomes because I don't have those other steps of causal link, modifier, modifiable factor, et cetera, validation, then it's not clear that we're going to get any good out of that, right? Yeah. That's a sort of fundamentally big challenge here.
Yeah, and you make the point of like the causal aspect of things, right? Like, I think that when you get clinical with things and you go from a machine making a decision to the human being able to make the decision, or like where that switch off becomes, I think you have to understand the why behind things. But I think when it comes to, and totally correct me if I'm wrong, because this is at least what I'm thinking in my head right now is if we're having a prediction of, who's going to be a cost driver in your organization, who's going to be a top cost driver for, RX, who's going to be a cost driver for just total cost. At that point, maybe we don't need so much clinical trial aspect of like, hey, did this work? Maybe it's okay if that's like, a 40% accuracy. But once you get into that aspect of like, is this algorithm going to work in saving someone's life? Maybe we do need to go deeper. Is that sort of the thought process?
I think it's close. I mean, the
Okay.
cost piece, let's talk about that for a second, right?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
On the clinical side, I totally agree with you. Clinical validation definitely needed. On the cost side, I think it depends a little bit. There's probably one more layer of nuance I think that's worth talking about, right?
Yeah.
So relatively recently, I think in the last 6 months to 12 months, there was a randomized trial that was done together with the Camden Coalition in Camden, New Jersey, right? And so there was a gentleman named named Jeffrey Brenner, who started the Camden Coalition. Atul Gawande wrote about it in the context of hotspotting, the idea saying, if we can find individuals who are going to have really bad outcomes and cost a lot of money, and we target programs at them, then we can probably improve their outcomes. And Dr. Brenner, I think being very well-intentioned, charted some of the paths of the patients that he was following. And a lot of these people had pretty severe social determinants of health challenges and housing instability and homelessness and many challenges. And through his efforts, he said, if I look at people who are really high cost in 1 year and I direct a bunch of resources at them, in the next year, it looks like they're 50% of that cost. And so he won a MacArthur Genius Award. I mean, I think a lot of good things that came out of that. The interesting thing, though, is that they later on, credit to him, did a randomized trial where they took his suite of interventions and they applied them, they randomized patients to either get this suite of interventions or not. And what they found is that actually the control group had a similar reduction in cost. And it wasn't that the interventions were useless. I think the issue was that we have a lot of random variation in healthcare, and we have something called regression to the mean, which is basically that if you have a particular spike in your spending in 1 year, you're very likely to return toward the average in the next year, right? And that if you don't rigorously study this in a randomized trial, it looks like your interventions are really working because you're picking people who are spiking in their healthcare costs. And just by random chance, in the next year, they're going to come down and it's going to look like your intervention works. And so the cost piece of it, I think it's important because we tend to, and by we here, I mean as an industry, right? And the Medicare Advantage side, certainly, I think just in general, for cost, Ned, there's a little bit more nuance, right? On the clinical side, totally agree with you. We can all agree that we need a benchmark standard. On the cost side, I think a lot of it depends on how we're using those cost predictions, right? I think if we're using them to generate hypotheses, to develop new programs, to understand why people are higher cost, fairly safe ground, I would totally agree with you. Predictive analytics towards cost, not troubled by a ton of issues. At the same time, I think the way that a lot of Medicare Advantage plans and insurers and hospital systems are using those cost predictions are actually applied in a clinical way. And then I think we start to regenerate some of the interesting challenges. So let me give you 2 examples actually that I think are pretty revealing about what this means. So, in the world of predicting high cost patients, there's a pioneer who started maybe 10, 15 years ago, Dr. Jeffrey Brenner at the Camden Coalition. Okay, he had started this whole concept of hotspotting, which then Atul Gawande wrote about, and it became almost, spread like wildfire, almost as like religion amongst insurers and health systems. Like, we got to do hotspotting because that's the way to control costs. We do know in pretty much every set of, any set of insured populations or maybe even uninsured populations that a small proportion of people tend to drive a disproportionate amount of the cost. So it seems to be logical. Let's focus on these people. Now, what Dr. Brenner did is he took a pretty disadvantaged population in Camden, New Jersey, and many of them had pretty big social determinants of health challenges, homelessness, drugs, alcohol dependency, many other issues, and income, education, health literacy, keep going, right? So he developed a multi-component intervention where he actually really tried to meet patients where they were, help them with access to social services, care for them as a doctor and a clinic could, which is what Camden Coalition really was, with Dr. Brenner at the helm. And I think to his credit, he tried to understand the data, and what he found overall is that if you track the trajectory of these patients, that in 1 year they're high cost, and through his work, it seemed like in the next year, half of those costs went away. It seemed like a very effective intervention. To his credit, he actually teamed up with some economists and researchers to actually do a randomized trial where they actually looked at what the effects were. And the effects, I would say, were nothing short of shocking. Okay, what we actually found is that the control group, they actually had patients randomized to the Camden Coalition set of services and randomized to not getting them. That control group that didn't get them, they also experienced that 30, 40, 50% drop in healthcare costs. And that's, in science, what we would call regression to the mean, which is basically there's a lot of volatility. If you catch somebody at the peak of their spending, in the next time period, their spending goes down just by random variation. And if you target your program exactly at that peak and you study it, it looks like my intervention is really effective, right? And so one thing is, if we're doing really well at targeting high-cost patients, we can be tricked into thinking that things work. And I think to the extent that we're then deploying this at scale and allocating resources may not be the most efficient way and may not be the most fair way to do it, okay? Yeah. Second story I'll tell you is a good friend of mine, actually, Ziad Obermeyer, looked at an algorithm. I think they unfortunately weren't able to disclose what that algorithm is or was, but they looked at an algorithm that was used as part of a population health management program to deliver care management. So in the hospital and transitions out of the hospital, in the emergency department of the big health system. And what they actually found is, because of the way that algorithm was actually trained, the way it was developed, it was intended to predict high cost. Now, it turns out, right, and none of you guys are going to be surprised by this, but patients who have Medicaid, they look lower cost because Medicaid pays lower rates compared to a commercial insurance company. And so if you take a patient who has the same burden of disease, is the same risk, right, has the same exact utilization, right? The commercial patient looks higher cost. The Medicaid patient looks lower cost. If you use cost to target populations, right, or target patients, then you end up in this really squirrely kind of conundrum, which is, I am targeting costs. That's true, right? I'm being fair about that. But what I'm really doing is deploying more and more resources to people who have commercial insurance rather than Medicaid. And who really needs those resources? Probably the people who are Medicaid, right? And they actually took it and looked at the racial factors. So, this was in Massachusetts. The population in Medicaid was disproportionately Black. The population that was in commercial insurance was disproportionately white. And so basically you're allocating resources to white people to the detriment of Black people, which is probably not what AI is really supposed to be trying to do, right? So well-intentioned algorithms that are really about cost can totally mislead us in how we actually implement them. That's dangerous. That's when I say, doing this kind of in an armchair way and not realizing what's happening underneath in the data piece, in the data process, can lead us astray.
Now, that kind of brings me to this thought that I'm having right now of like, you build algorithms.
I do.
Okay? You are also a doctor. You're also a clinician. You're also a researcher. Like, you understand the intricacies of what goes into these decisions. You understand the intricacies of saying, oh, well, I get that Medicaid pays a lower rate, so let me dig into the data one step deeper. My question becomes, because I can tell you any of the people that are listening to this right now that are part of MSOs or IPAs, any of the executives that we're listening to, that what you're talking about, that chronic care management, they're focused on that. They're saying, okay, well, how do I predict these people that are going to go to the hospital? How do I predict I then put them in a program that is going to lower costs? But with what you just said, it's like, okay, well, this sort of could be a little squirrely. Well, I guess the question is, you might not have the answer, and that's totally okay. But the question is, well, how do we get to the point of like you writing an algorithm? Because I think for me, my career started in Silicon Valley, right? And so I know the guys that are writing some of these algorithms have never stepped foot in a hospital unless they broke a leg. How do they know the intricacies, the ins and outs of things, right? So my question becomes like, hey, how do we get to the point where we're not having such a squirrely little like back and forth between AI and the outcomes?
Yeah, great question. I think really hard question. Which is great because you're asking the hard questions. So I think a couple of things, right? So I think one, it is incumbent on the algorithm developer to share a sense of responsibility. I think, quite frankly, again, I believe that the vast majority of algorithm developers out there are very well intentioned. If you look back at that particular commercial algorithm that was doing the racially biased predictions, as we call them, I believe that they were trying to do the right thing because they're trying to control costs, right? They're trying to help give tools to providers like hospital systems to deploy resources to try to cut costs, right, and manage patients better. So very well intentioned. I still think it's our responsibility to understand. We're developing more of this understanding of how things can go awry, right? Mm-hmm. Good intentions are not enough here. So what we need to do is really have a responsibility to partner with somebody who understands what in economics we call the institutional details. To your point, just to understand what happens in the within the four walls of a hospital, to understand how clinical decisions get made, if that's the data you're working on. If you're working on insurance data, then go talk to somebody who really understands insurance data. Bring them. It's your responsibility as an algorithm developer to have those people on your team, right? Working with you hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, pick your metaphor, right? So I think that's number one. Number two, I think so far it's a growing science. So I don't want to be too overly dramatic about this. I would say to date, to some extent, it's been a failure of the scientific community. I put myself in that bucket. I would say the reason I don't want to be too dramatic about it is because I think we're learning rapidly right now how AI can go bad. And I think maybe 5 years ago, we didn't have that extent of understanding. So, it's probably not too fair to blame everybody. But I think now we are starting to generate that understanding. So it's incumbent upon the scientific community to actually try to lay out a template, guidelines, structure for how you build these algorithms and how you test them for untoward effects, right? And if we can develop algorithms that do that, if we can develop methodologies, if we can develop templates and checklists and structure, then I believe actually the industry will pick those up. I mean, there will be naturally, right? If you again, take a step back here, what I'm saying to you in some sense is that you can focus on chronic care management programs, and really at the end of the day, you're pouring resources into it as a health insurance company, and you're not really getting bang for your buck. You might be tricked into thinking you're getting bang for your buck. So if there's somebody else, call it another startup, another company, a group of researchers, whoever, who develops something that can actually vet your program or vet your algorithm and say, hey, are you actually getting a real ROI on this? I believe the executives and health insurance companies would love that because they would want to know that they're spending their money wisely, right? So I think we need to generate that part of the industry. We need to generate those protocols, that discipline, so that way it's not, we can demystify it. It's not a mystery of, so how do I do responsible algorithm development? And I don't think we're there yet. And I think now the scientific community has at least recognized that this is a problem. So now we need to take a step toward the solution.
Yeah. I think a lot of, you said demystify, which I think is, it's great because the conversations that I have on a day-to-day basis with these physician executives is sort of this like, well, how do we get to like prediction? How do we get to that AI, right? And so there is this like almost just mystifying aspect of like, okay, it's going to be the silver bullet, and where like for me, my career started in the fitness industry, far away from medical, but we had AI, right? We started an app that was a personal training app that AI, based on the weights that you put in, based on the, outcomes, based on you saying, oh, this was a good lift versus a bad lift, it told you exactly what the next lift needed to be the next week, right? But we didn't have to think beyond a bench press, right? We weren't thinking life and death. We weren't thinking, people's besides health, which is, important. But I look at it this way, you talk about demystifying. It's almost like when Tesla first came out and they were like, oh, self-driving cars, that's ridiculous. And it's like, well, how does that happen? And then we're all like, what? And then you see people sleeping on the road with Tesla now, and you don't even think twice about it. Do you, I'll be honest, I still think twice. But do you think that we'll ever get to the point in healthcare? Because I know it's such an evolving science, but do you ever think we'll get to the point where we're just going to go, oh, well, I'm going to the hospital to get, this cyst removed. Of course, I know it's going to be AI making the decisions.
I think so. I think we'll get there. I don't think we're immediately there.
Yeah.
What I would say is that, so actually the car driving analogy is a really interesting one, right? Because what I would have said 5-7 years ago is that AI is best primed to be used to solve very discrete problems, right? So it's kind of like your, little robot vacuum cleaner that goes around your house, right? So take that for example, it has a very discrete task. It's not trying to clean your whole house, right? That would be a much bigger task. It's just cleaning your floor. It's smart. It learns the layout of your house, and it can avoid obstacles and whatever else, right? So that's pretty clever AI, but it has a very focused problem to try to solve, right? And I think in that sense, we're ready for AI, even in medicine, I think, to do that. And we're seeing that, not to downplay the complexity of this, but if you look at now the computer-aided retinal detection of diseases, for example, or diagnosis, right? So fairly discrete problem, fairly reliable set of data that is objective, that's not filtered by a clinician. It's going to see the retinal scan every time, right? And it's not just for some patient, not the other. And so I think in that kind of world, AI is going to thrive, right? The fact that actually we've gotten to self-driving cars is pretty amazing, because that's not a discrete task, right?
No.
I love, I love reading stories about the development of it. I think I remember hearing a story of one of the first self-driving cars was following the rules of the law. And so when it came to a stop at a stop sign, it wouldn't go until at a four-way stop until all the other cars at the other sides of the intersection had come to a full stop, right? And pretty much nobody comes to a full stop. And so the car got stuck at the stop sign. It couldn't go. And there was a half mile of cars that are built up behind it because it couldn't get past the stop sign. And so, obviously there's a lot of work that's gone in, but it's pretty amazing the complexity of what it has to actually infer from its environment and then make decisions. The fact that we can do that in the context of driving gives me a lot of hope, man. It gives me a lot of hope that we can do this in medicine, because that's a really complicated task. And the fact that we can develop AI to do that means, yes, we need to understand some of these non-random data generating processes. And there's obviously human factors at play, but hey, there's human factors in driving too.
Yeah.
And so if we can, again, develop responsible algorithms, I think there is hope here. I think we can get there. The point I would say, though, is that where we are, right, I think we're still in the world of the vacuum, the home vacuum cleaner right now, right? I think we're still trying to solve pretty discrete problems. The retinal scan one's a good example. I think there's a bunch of other areas where we're getting AI that can augment people's decisions or may actually be able to enhance them, right? But they're still pretty focused areas. I think the hope of the sort of Watson project at IBM, which is that you're going to have a computer just replace humans. I think that's really hard. And I think the pieces that make it really, really hard to me is that at the other end of the algorithm, right? So there's the developer and there's the data generating process. right? Which sometimes are humans. So that's a complexity. But at the end of the day, the very, very end of that process is a patient. That patient is a human, right? And if you ask a patient, if you ask one human, how bad does this hurt? Somebody will say 8 out of 10, somebody will say 12 out of 10, and somebody else will say 3 out of 10.
Yeah.
And it may be objectively the same pain level, but we have so much subjectivity in the human experience that is a big challenge. And I think that's where I would, to venture a guess, I would say, not in the next decade are we going to see a full-scale AI system that's going to replace a doctor. But I do think we're going to see a lot of AI adjuncts to human decision-making, whether it's a spell-checking type thing, whether it is making us more efficient in how we interpret data, whether it can take something that would otherwise require specialty care, like reading images, and then make that possible at scale using machines. I think these focus pieces will grow rapidly. And I think we're probably actually the start of this kind of exponential increase, because I think we are going to do well in that space. The part that, like I said, gives me the most pause is this question of using clinical data that is not generated uniformly for everyone, where particularly when a human, meaning the patient, is also responsible for telling you stuff as an input into the algorithm, then that's just like orders of magnitude harder.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say that's why I'm glad that we have doctors like you that are at the forefront of this and are doing this every single day and understanding this. As we kind of end today, I wanted to get your opinion on what are you personally most excited about when it comes to the future of healthcare?
So I'm very excited right now because I think we have all recognized that we have challenges in healthcare disparities, right, in social determinants of health. I think COVID has put another lens on it. I think all the racial injustice stuff that's been going on has also put a second lens on it. And I think maybe, just maybe, we can have a commitment to it that's not going to evaporate. It's not ephemeral. And I think we need to start from the very core pieces of how we deliver care, but really how we also pay for care. And one of the other areas that I work a lot in is specifically in healthcare payment. And I think if we can really make a concerted effort now, unlike some of the AI stuff, which I think is going to be a decade-long process to get some of the building blocks, I think here we can actually make some meaningful impact and progress over the next several years in trying to fix, if you will, how the healthcare system generates these, what I would call, ridiculous inequalities. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we have so much focus, we have attention from politicians, from health systems, from patients, from advocacy groups, I'm really hopeful that we can make really meaningful progress here in the next few years.
Yeah, that's awesome. And there's always a silver lining to things that, definitely are pretty negative in the outcome of COVID and the racial injustices. But I agree with you 100% that I think that it's shown a very bright light on some of the places that we need to get better at in the healthcare industry. And so I'm extremely excited. And Dr. Navathe, I am thankful for you taking the time in a tropical storm. Really appreciate that. Where can they find you online? I know you're all over, especially with your articles and things like that. So tell everyone where they can find you and find all of your research as well.
Sure. So probably the easiest ways at the University of Pennsylvania, there's an institute called the Leonard Davis Institute. So if you go to LDI, that's LD as in dog, I.upenn.edu, there's a list of experts. I'll be listed there. I have a web page. You can click on it. You can email me. You can see the work that I'm up to. You can see my publications. You can see the policy that I work that I do in DC and other countries. And I'm certainly happy to discuss and hear people's critiques as well.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much again for joining us. I would recommend anyone go to that page and just read your research because it's ridiculous. I found myself down like 2 or 3 rabbit holes when I would go. I was just clicking on links. I was like, oh my gosh. So this is awesome. And again, thank you so much for coming on and hey, stay safe up there.
Great. Thanks, Ned. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Have a good one.